don't know how I follow that, to be honest. Because what I'm going to be talking about is a significant gear change in terms of focus, because I'm going to be talking about the findings from a survey we conducted to understand Australians' understanding and knowledge of coercive control and their support for criminalisation. So most of us will be aware that there are currently ongoing conversations about the relative merits and consequences associated with the criminalisation of coercive controlling behaviours as standalone offences. So we've got Queensland, who's looking at implementing legislation soon. New South Wales, their legislation's coming through next year. WA, South Australia are in the process of implementing legislation. And Tasmania has had coercive control embedded in its legislation since 2004, specifically financial abuse and emotional abuse. So, I mean, obviously we know that coercive control is a form or pattern of abuse within familial and intimate relationships, underpinned by a desire for dominance and control. Evan Stark refers to it as a form of liberty crime because it's really about limiting people's autonomy and ability to live independent lives, and they become entrapped in their lives. But whenever I talk about coercive control, I like to tell the stories of someone with lived experience of coercive control to really ground it in its context, so that we're not just talking about it in these arbitrary kind of nebulous ways, but to remember that we're talking about people's lives when we're talking about coercive control. So I spoke to Maria as part of my PhD research, and she had been with her partner Adam, so not their real names, for about 30 years when I was talking to her. So right from the get-go, they met when she was still in high school and he was in his early 20s, big red flag. And their relationship had been characterised by high levels of controlling and domineering behaviours by Adam towards Maria. So what that looked like was the day they got married, he sat her down and said, "Now you're my wife, I need you to know what I expect, and that's that you will have dinner on the table at this time, you're not going to have a job, you're going to stay home and look after the kids, you're going to look a certain way, you're going to wash my clothes with a certain washing powder," and so on and so forth. So very, very kind of strict rules. He was also very financially abusive towards her, so he worked full time, but she did not because she was the primary carer for their kids. But he told her, "I'll pay for the mortgage, everything else that I earn is my money, but you have to look after everything else." And this was despite the fact that she wasn't actually working. So she had to get part-time work so she could pay for the utilities, for the groceries, for all of the things related to the care of their children, and so on and so forth. So there's a massive disparity in terms of their earning capacity, but also the division of financial kind of responsibilities within the relationship. He was emotionally abusive. He called her fat and ugly on a fairly regular occurrence. And he was also very good at sabotaging any attempts that she made to try and get some level of independence within the relationship. So she left school before year 12, before completing year 12. And she went back to school and was completing year 12. On the morning of her exams, he called her and told her, "Well, because you've been so unavailable to me, because you've been studying, I've had an affair." And he told her that on the first morning of her exams, and subsequently she did not do as well on her exams as she would have done. She was coming top of the class and she said, "That really sticks in my craw. I should have really done a lot better." But he did that on purpose, effectively. So when I spoke to Maria, she had been out of this relationship for 10 years, thankfully. And after a period of significant escalated risk where he was threatening to kill her and their children after she left him, she was now safe. Her kids had grown up as well, and they were safe as well, so touch wood. Everything was a lot better for Maria. But when we're thinking about the criminalisation of coercive control, we're really talking about those non-physical forms of abuse that are not currently criminalised at a state and territory level, so things like financial abuse, emotional abuse, restricting your contact with employment, with study opportunities, and so on and so forth. So that's really what we're talking about. But as part of these ongoing conversations, they're really kind of happening in the absence of a really good evidence base about what the community understands to be coercive control, our attitudes towards coercive control, and also our level of support for the criminalisation of these types of offences. And that's really what we wanted to do. So we conducted a survey of 3,500 Australians using a nationally representative sample, which means that we weren't just limited to what the respondents said. We could kind of use them as an indicator of what the broader Australian public would kind of be thinking about coercive control and their support for criminalisation. So there's a lot of information about the methods if that's what you're kind of into, and the report has been released on the Centre for Social Research and Methods website, so guarantee it's a good read. We wrote it and we're very proud of it. So what did we find from our survey? So in the first instance, the vast majority of Australians do not believe that coercive controlling behaviours are okay. So about 95% said it was unacceptable, meaning that we had a range of about 2 to 7% of people who said that different forms of coercive controlling behaviours were unacceptable. So we asked people about 13 different types of non-physical forms of coercive control. So we were asking about threatening behaviours, so things like threatening to harm her, family members, pets, things of that kind of nature. We asked about financial abuse, monitoring behaviours. We asked about parental isolation, so threatening to take your kids away from you. And we also asked about social restrictions, so limiting who you see, who you hang out with, your access to things like the internet, the car, those kinds of stuff. So what we found is that condoning and minimising behaviours, or attitudes, towards coercive control was very, very small when we looked at things like threats. So making explicit threats to harm was very, very small levels of condoning and minimising behaviours, so about 2%. But what we saw is that when we were asking about social restrictive behaviours, so things like limiting someone's contact with family members, monitoring their behaviours, limiting their use of the phone, the internet, or the car, limiting where they go, things like that, condoning and minimising attitudes got quite large. So we're looking at about 5 to 7%. So what this kind of tells us is that when we're thinking about people's understanding and attitudes towards coercive control, we're pretty good at identifying and condemning certain types of behaviours, so there's things like threats, which are already standalone offences in most legislation. But when we're getting into those more, I guess, insidious and nuanced, context-dependent behaviours, there's still a way to go in terms of ensuring that people are able to recognise these as forms of abuse. However, although 95% of people said these behaviours are wrong, only 55% of people said they actually knew what coercive control was. So when we asked them, do you know what it means? Only 55% said yes. So what this kind of suggests is that we're pretty good at identifying behaviours as wrong, but the language maybe hasn't disseminated into the community as much as we would have expected it to. Because, I mean, really over the last 5 years, coercive control has become a real, I guess, term that we have seen being used in the media as part of criminal justice agencies. Certainly I've been analysing sentencing reports for homicide offenders, and you can really see that coercive control as a language is starting to come into that kind of lexicon that we're seeing. But obviously it's not necessarily disseminating into the community more broadly. Another really interesting finding is that 95% of people say it's a wrong behaviour, it's unacceptable. Only 83% supported criminalisation. 83% is still really high, like that's 4 out of 5 people, so that's significant. But there's obviously this gap between people saying it's wrong and it should be a criminal offence. And I think that that's a really important finding, because I think we can look at that and go, well, most people say it should be a criminal offence, let's go do it. But there is some nuance around this finding that we need to be really careful about, because once we make something a criminal offence, we enter it into a system that may not necessarily lead to better outcomes for women. And of course, we don't have the data to kind of dig into that with this data set, but I think that this is a real finding for pause. But the community is a big, nebulous, wibbly-wobbly thing. So we would expect that there would be diversity within the sample, within the community, in terms of who understands coercive control and attitudes towards coercive control. And certainly we did find that understanding and attitudes differed across the community. So I'm just going to focus on a couple here. So, unsurprisingly, and consistent with what we know from some Scottish research that's been undertaken, men were more likely to have condoning and minimising attitudes towards coercive control. And this was across a number of the 13 different behaviours that we asked them about. But in particular, what I found really interesting was, again, this difference that we saw around socially restrictive behaviours. So although only about 2% of women said things like limiting or attempting to restrict where they go and who they're associated with was okay, so it was acceptable or something that just happened, that increased to 7% of men. And that was quite consistent across the different socially restrictive behaviours that we were asking about. So women were able to identify these as wrong behaviours, unacceptable, but men were more likely to have condoning attitudes. Again, this kind of tells us that we've got a bit of a way to go in terms of informing the community's attitudes towards coercive control. We also found that men were less likely to know what coercive control is, and they were also less likely to support criminalisation. We also found some really interesting stuff around age. So I had this perception as someone almost 40 of kind of going, kids these days with their new education in primary schools and high schools and watching my kids going through and talking about consent, I was like, it's fine. They're the new generation, the way of coming through. So I would have expected to kind of, I guess, anecdotally see a generational difference in terms of younger people being able to identify behaviours, coercive controlling behaviours as unacceptable, and that as we get older, it's probably less likely that we'll be able to identify it as unacceptable. We did see a generational difference, but not the way that we would have expected it to play out. We actually found that younger people were more likely to have condoning and minimising attitudes towards coercive controlling behaviours than older people, and this real kind of, I guess, decline in condoning and minimising behaviours happened at about 35. So 18 to 24 and 25 to 34, pretty condoning, and then it landslide very quickly. So in particular, what we saw is that monitoring where someone is and who they associate with, about 2 to 3% of people who were 35 years and older said that that was just something that happened or was acceptable. This increased to 6% amongst 18 to 34-year-olds. We also found threatening or trying to commit suicide, especially as a means of making a person do or not do something. Again, about 2% when we look at the 35 plus. That increased to 6% when we're looking at the 18 to 34-year-olds. So again, just kind of tells us that we've got a bit of a way to go, particularly when we think about the findings from the National Community Attitude Survey that's administered by ANROS. They similarly found that amongst younger cohorts, they had the most condoning, minimising attitudes towards violence against women in different kinds of contexts, and had the most, I guess, victim-blaming attitudes towards things like sexual assault. They were also less likely to know what coercive control is, but there was no difference between younger people and older people in terms of support for criminalisation. So what we really saw with the support for criminalisation, it was very steady across the age groups at about 80%. But there was a really interesting linear relationship between age and understanding of what coercive control is, where basically as you get older, more likely you are to know what coercive control is. Okay, so also we found that people from non-English speaking backgrounds, so people who spoke the language other than English most of the time at home or were born in a country other than Australia, where it was primarily non-English speaking, they were less likely to know what coercive control is, and they were also less likely to support criminalisation. And this was particularly noticeable amongst men from non-English speaking backgrounds. So this finding is not unexpected, considering that, I guess Australians like to say this, but internationally we are considered to be on the forefront in terms of research on domestic and family violence and conversations about coercive control. We're one of the only jurisdictions internationally that are at an advanced stage of looking at criminalisation, if you consider that to be an arbiter of how seriously we're taking the issue. We've also got alternative programs, different kinds of programs for offenders and things like that. So we're considered to be quite progressive. So this is not unexpected if you think that this is just an exposure effect. So potentially people from non-English speaking backgrounds have not been exposed to the same conversations, the same language, and the same kinds of education that people born in Australia may have been. And the final finding was really around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So what we found is that they were less likely than non-Indigenous people to support criminalisation. However, there was no difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in terms of understanding of what coercive control is. So the highest levels of support for criminalisation were amongst non-Indigenous women at 88%. It decreased to 80% for non-Indigenous men, then 76% for Indigenous women, and then again to 63% for Indigenous men. So this again is not an unexpected finding. In all of the conversations we're currently having about the criminalisation of coercive control, there have been numerous First Nations advocacy groups, advocates, practitioners and academics who have suggested that this could potentially have bad implications for their communities. In particular, it could contribute to the over-policing of these communities, over-representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in criminal justice populations, and also towards the misidentification of women as primary perpetrators. Just to say, the misidentification issue that has been raised has also been raised by non-Indigenous women as well, but it's basically the suggestion that coercive control legislation could be weaponised by people who are controlling as a form of abuse and control. So basically saying, well, remember that time you called me a dickhead? Well, that's a form of abuse. I could get the police to arrest you. So really, as my take home is that we are pretty good at identifying abusive behaviours, coercive controlling behaviours, as unacceptable as forms of abuse. And this attitudes does vary across the community, which means that we need to do some more work around that. But I think that the really big sticking point for me is this 83% figure. That there is this gap between understanding that these forms of behaviour are unacceptable and thinking that a criminal justice response is the most appropriate. But we will be talking about that in a little bit with Lorana around policy implications. And I'll leave that with you. Thanks, guys.
Are there any questions at this point for Holly? Hayley, pardon me. Hayley. Yes, up back.
I just wondered, given that Tasmania has now had that experience of legislation, whether you picked up any difference in the data of the Tasmanian cohort on whether they thought legislation was appropriate?
Really good question. I was going to talk about Tasmania, but I got the 3-minute warning. So we did look at Tasmania because exactly the point that you just raised. What we found was, and we have to be careful because the sample is small, because a nationally representative sample means that it's kind of population based. So we only had a small number of Tasmanians, about 80 to 100, I think. So what we found was that there was nothing that we could observe statistically in terms of attitudes towards coercive control. However, when you actually eyeball the numbers, very, very, very small numbers of people from Tasmania who condone and minimise coercive controlling behaviours, like it's 1 or 2 people. Very, very small, but samples are too small to kind of say with any statistical kind of power. But what we did find is that controlling for a range of other factors, that people who were living in Tasmania compared to the rest of Australia were much more likely to support criminalisation. And understanding that is a bit difficult because we don't really understand what the kind of mechanism is there. It could be that they've already criminalised aspects of it, so they don't see it necessarily as a massive issue to expand definitions of coercive control and things like that. It could be an effect of the legislation has helped them to, I guess, have more, condemnatory attitudes towards coercive control, and so they're more comfortable with the criminal justice response. It could be that there weren't many, if any, Indigenous people within that sample. But yeah, so we did observe that difference, and we try to explain it a bit in the report, but yeah, we did identify that one.
Michelle?
Thank you so much for that presentation. I guess I thought you were very intrigued by this finding that it's the younger age group that is involved in this kind of condoning and minimising. Do you remember what it was
18 to 24, and then the 25 to 34. So we kind of smushed them together because really when you look at the trends over the age groups, condoning and minimising attitudes really drops off at 35.
Right.
And to be fair, like, the differences are like 2% versus 6 or 7%.
Statistically significant?
Yeah, statistically significant, but, you know, like, still the overwhelming majority of young people still say these behaviours are unacceptable.
Yes.
I guess the question I had was, do you have plans to kind of
answer is the only other intersection we look at in the report is gender and age, and with very similar trends. So it's not like young boys are dragging everything down. It's kind of across all the age cohorts, it's very much the same trend. But yeah, we can address that question more fully in policy. Yeah.
Hayley, can I ask a question? Because some people may not be across this. The capacity for criminal legislation to lead to misidentification. You gave a kind of just short example.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways in which that has happened? In other words, it's against the ideal victim stereotype.
It is. It's a really tricky one to unpack because I don't necessarily think that coercive control legislation is the thing that's going to lead to that happening. I think it's a limitation of criminal justice responses as a kind of a bench line. That there are victim survivors who have said that the criminal justice system has been weaponised against them by their manipulative partners as a way of misidentifying them. So, for example, when women are in a state of heightened emotional kind of response and the police are attending, there's the concept of the good guy syndrome, where the bloke is very, very good at appearing really congenial and really like, maybe she's just gone off the deep end, she's had some alcohol or she's taken something and she appears to be shaken and not very coherent and very easy for police to go, you look like the problem, not him. And so, particularly in the context of if she's used self-defensive violence, there may be evidence that he has been assaulted. And so they go, well, this is what's kind of happened. And I mean, this issue is exacerbated by the fact that most policing policies in relation to responding to domestic and family violence is not gendered. It does not really include language to encourage police of, if she appears to be the problem, dig a little deeper. So Anne Rose did some really good research around that to kind of go policy. So when police turn up, it's very much, there's evidence that an incident has occurred, we have evidence of this occurring, we are now duty bound to arrest. There's not really attention to the broader context. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.